Hello, everybody. It is Tara Boothby, and these are Conversations for Restoration on our Sojourn Psychology YouTube. And we have a fellow Canadian, Western Canadian today from Kamloops, British Columbia. And this is Kyle Norman, Reverend Kyle Norman.
Yes.
So
Yes.
thanks for
Yeah.
coming, Kyle.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited too. And I'm curious, right? Because we've never had a conversation like this. We have
Sure. Yeah.
similarities.
Hmm.
And so I guess, okay, so for you, Kyle, first off, so you're Reverend Kyle Norman and you're at St. Paul's Cathedral. And
Yes.
so what does that mean? St. Paul's Cathedral, what is that?
Sure. So I'm an Anglican. Usually when people think of cathedrals, they think Roman Catholic. But I'm an Anglican, so Anglicans have cathedrals as well. As an Anglican, I'm married, my wife she's also a psychologist, and so here in Kamloops. Being the priest at the cathedral means, in the Anglican context, is that I have a church responsibility. The parish is I'm the rector of the church. I'm the priest. I do the funerals, the weddings, the services. But as being at the cathedral, I also have an area responsibility of all of the Anglican churches. I help the bishop manage them within our area.
Cool, cool. And so I guess, and then Anglican, so I know
There,
something else I want to talk about,
we can
but
totally get into that. Yeah,
oh yeah, totally. So
yeah.
for you, I guess with this conversations of restoration, and I see how you fit in, but from your sort of introducing yourself to this restorative conversation, can you give people a bit of a sense of your story of like how restoring faith or love or the divinity.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, really the entrance point for me getting into these conversations is every single church that I've been in, and I've been ordained for about 23 years now. Every single church that I've been in, I've met people who carry around a secret guilt or shame because they feel like they're doing their spirituality wrong. And these are not like faithless people. These are not people who are new to the church. Sometimes these are people who have sat in the same pew for 30 years. But, they read Christian books or they listen to sermons that talk about God answering prayer and they think, I don't know if ever God's answered my prayers. Or they'll hear, rhetoric about, the warm fuzzies of Jesus in our hearts. And they will say, I don't know if I've ever felt that, or I don't know if I always feel the love of God. And so where I come in is trying to have conversations with people about what I have turned kind of the spiritual discouragement
Mm.
and trying to get them to see that that type of feeling is actually part of the life of faith. And we can kind of reframe that conversation. It doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. Um, let's talk about the dynamics of that discouragement in your spiritual life,
Mhm.
which is actually a part of our lives of faith and our spiritual lives.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that language. You have some really beautiful language that you use. And one of those phrases, spiritual discouragement.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I've started to use that particularly and it almost in some sense as a reaction against the the trend of faith deconstruction. And which has become kind of really quite popular,
Mm.
and people kind of leaving the church because, well, I need to deconstruct my faith. And then sometimes what happens at the end of that is that you're not left with a whole lot. And so what happens if you're struggling, but you actually don't want to jettison yourself of everything of the faith?
Mhm.
What happens if you don't want to jettison yourself of the church that you and the people that you love and the church that you have grown up in? What's left for you? And so I really wanted to talk about that kind of messy
Yeah.
place and how that's actually there is a way forward in the midst of that.
I think so too. And I love that confused conversation of I the more I view the term deconstruction through the philosophical lens, I don't mind it.
Sure,
But
sure.
we're misusing it
Yeah,
when we only put it in the wheelhouse of theology, not even theology, but just in religion.
yeah,
If
yeah,
deconstruction is only happening within a religious belief, I'm doing it wrong, because
yeah.
it's all of the ologies hanging out together. And in corporate worship, ideally, if it's spiritual deconstruction,
Sure.
but in
Yeah.
community, you can't play the glass bead game without a partner.
No, absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
So if
Yeah.
if you're playing marbles by yourself, you're going to lose your marbles.
Yeah, yeah, you are. Exactly. I love that. That's fabulous. Exactly. Yeah, and I understand that there are people, particularly if they're coming out of toxic backgrounds with toxic teachings, yeah, you need to deconstruct a whole lot. Like there's a lot that you need to unpack. What happens popularly is that people, and I think what's happened is that sometimes people grab onto that term and say, well, I'm struggling in prayer. Oh, there's got to be something wrong with God or with prayer or with me. And so I'm going to deconstruct it all. Well, no, not necessarily. Like let's lean into this a little bit more.
Yeah.
Everybody struggles with prayer. Like, and so that's not necessarily a bad or an inappropriate thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also too, like when we're talking about the season many people are going through right now, there's just this mass group that are viewing some spiritual abuse or some
Yeah.
institutional trauma. When we awaken from denial, when we've been in an abusive environment and we awaken from denial, in the psychology office, we don't call that deconstructing. We call that
Okay. Yeah.
beginning our healing journey. Like when I look at something, I'm like, oh wow, I maybe it's okay for, you know, I don't know, girls who wear bikinis. Maybe it's
Sure. Yeah.
okay to
Yeah.
struggle
Yeah.
with prayer. Maybe it's okay to
Yep.
ask hard questions, or
Yeah.
to, you
Yep.
know, uh, those sorts of things. Or viewing what was inappropriate, power lorded over me, or
Sure.
how I
Yeah.
lorded power over others.
Yeah.
Be awakening to the trauma.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes we're misconstruing that as
Sure.
deconstructing. I'm just waking up.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I know that there are people now, like, at least in the faith context, and I don't know if this plays in with that, who are beginning to articulate the need to reconstruct.
Yes.
Because they've noticed that, like, I watch a lot of culinary shows, and deconstruction was a big thing, and like let's make something that tastes like meatloaf but doesn't look like meatloaf and all stuff. But in the faith world, they've realized that that doesn't actually work because you're just not left with anything. And so now people are starting to talk about, well, what is on the other side? Like what are we beginning into? If there is a needed question we need to wrestle with, or a movement we need to make, or a growth that we need to happen, well, let's make sure that we understand how we're actually moving forward and not just left aimlessly in this spiritual nebula.
Yeah, Nebula. There's a great one. Yeah, and oh my word, I love that you're bringing up culinary shows, because that's a great example.
Sure.
And like those shows, the people who fail, they deconstruct it into nothing, or
Yes, exactly.
it's disassembled.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
when we touch trauma, there's a risk that we disassemble, that
Hmm.
we compartmentalize, that the pendulum swings the other way, and we are overprotected, or we put ourselves at risk because all of a sudden we see the trauma. But
Yeah.
healing through trauma, even if it's belief systems, we
Yep.
can have political beliefs and change those beliefs.
Yep.
But when we realize I believe something politically that I disagree with now, that can feel traumatic, just like
Sure.
religion.
Yep. Yeah. Absolutely. And yeah, exactly. And you know, I'm conscious in my tradition that we're in the season of Lent, which is within our church, it's a time that we are supposed to wrestle with these things.
Mm.
Um, as we, in the Christian context, as we journey with Jesus, who goes to the cross, who did not have the easiest time, who wrestled with prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, who on the cross asked, my God, where are you? Why have you forsaken me? If that's Jesus' journey, well, then that's also part of our journey of faith, these kind of deep moments of questions and wrestling. And that doesn't mean that we're doing something wrong. That
No,
actually means we're being authentic about our life with God and some of the messiness that happens.
okay, so should we nerd out about the Garden of Gethsemane a little
Oh,
bit?
let's do it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because I think about this a lot, and I think it's a beautiful example of nuances of the philosophy of deconstructing
Okay.
Jesus's
Yep.
experience and how even we view his humanity.
Yeah.
If we only view him as God, but if we
Hmm.
view him as a person, like he in his human experience
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
and his prayer, and then okay, so I don't know where you can go where you're going to go with this, Kyle. Can I call you Kyle or should I call you
Yeah. Call me Kyle.
Reverend
Absolutely. No,
Kyle?
no, no, no. Call me Kyle.
Okay, Kyle, first name basis. You can call me Tara.
Okay.
But I remember having this conversation actually with some church peers, and I'd been reading about Jesus in the garden, and I was drawn to tears. This is one of the last times I really, really read the Bible before it
Hmm.
just stopped really working for
Okay.
me. Um, and I was reading and he was going back and he'd be like, wake up. And he's
Hmm.
praying. He's like, take this from me, this punishment I
Sure. Yep. Yeah.
foresee.
Yep.
And
Yep.
he would go back and his friends are sleeping. And I'm like, you're facing death.
Yeah.
This is so traumatic, painful, crying tears, whether that's metaphorical, I believe, but
Yep.
it's like that's the anguish.
Sure. Yeah.
As
The
if
drops of
I,
blood. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yep.
as if I could cry blood.
Yeah.
Or he did. I don't know. But I was like, how brokenhearted for him
Exactly.
that
Absolutely.
his friends are sleeping.
Yeah. And I think, well, exactly. And there's a loneliness there. There is anguish there. Um, there is, in some sense, an unrealized prayer there, right? Like, so he prays, Father, take this cup from me. Um, but, and then he goes on, not as I will, but you will. But the cup isn't taken from him. Like, he's
No.
still, he leaves that garden and gets arrested, right? And so, like, there is an unrealized yearning that kind of is there. And so often what happens is we take that scene and we make it into this scene of victory, right? Oh, well, Jesus, well, but not by my will, but your will.
Yeah.
And then, it says the angels came and attended him. And so it's like, oh, this is this perfect moment of Jesus. And what we end up doing is we end up separating God from that place, Jesus from that place. The whole visceralness of the Garden of Gethsemane is that Jesus, as we would say, fully divine but fully human, enters into the darkness of that point and is fully present there. And if we separate it from that, then we kind of are saying that Jesus isn't, or God isn't with us in the darkest places of our lives.
Yeah.
We just need to be as victorious as Jesus was. But the fact that Jesus took on all of that mess, all of that loneliness, all of that anguish, all of that trauma, all of that kind of stuff, and did it and entered into that means that when I'm facing my stuff, I can, in some sense, and again, this is from the Christian background, but I can, in some sense, trust and believe that somewhere, even if I don't fully see it, I'm not alone in the midst of this dark thing that I'm whatever facing.
Yeah. And yeah, and I think like again, this is such a good example of like how we can deconstruct these lies we believed about God if we only view Jesus praying in the garden. He prayed all night, victory.
Yeah,
He
exactly.
prayed,
Yep.
but he doubted.
Yep. Absolutely.
He
Yep.
prayed a pray of like, I'm doubting this. I'm doubting this. Do I have to do this? Can I do this?
Yep.
He felt betrayed by his friends.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so whether you view like I'm fine to say that Jesus is God,
Yeah.
part of the God that I know. But even people who are just like, that's a great person.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
Here's this example of this great person
Yeah.
that many of us, whether we believe that's God or not,
Yeah.
have believed this lie of this superhuman experience where
Exactly.
if I if I doubt, there is that secret guilt or shame
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
spiritual discouragement. If I feel betrayed by my friends, there
Yeah.
is that secret guilt or shame, and there is that spiritual discouragement.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. And there's, condemnation um that heaps on that. There's a sense of judgment. There's a sense of fear that happens. Like, so what's going to happen when I die? When all of these secret doubts and feelings that I've had are fully exposed before God, is God going to say, you weren't actually as faithful as you said you were, so take the down escalator, please. Like, and people really feel that.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
And we know, like, we know we're like, so I'll write and I say we're flawed and fabulous, and
sure, yeah,
we bring it all along. There's no part that we really get away. That's good psychology. All of your
hmm
parts are
yeah,
in you. They're all a part of the inner dialogue, our inner cosmos. And so we know that in our scientific existence.
sure.
And the fear of there is no one worthy. There is no one
No,
worthy, not even
yeah,
one. And I am the one who's not worthy. So
yeah.
what does that mean for the elevator shaft on the other side?
Well, exactly, right? And unfortunately, and as a priest, I recognize that there's been some really horrible teachings in like the Big C church and church worldwide. And I remember talking to somebody who grew up under a very religious aunt. And I don't know what kind of branch of religion they were, or the branch of Christian church they were, but whenever this person stepped out of line, the or made a mistake, the aunt would wave her finger and say, God will get you for that. All right. And so this person grew up, and was a faithful person themselves. Um, but always in the back of their mind was this feeling that whatever they didn't pray as long as they thought they should have been praying, or read their Bible enough, or whatever enough was, um, there was always this little voice in the back of her head that said, God's going to get you for that.
Yeah.
Uh, and, God loves everybody else, but God's going to get you. Right. And that's that's a hard thing to sometimes silence. That's a hard voice to silence sometimes.
Well, and I mean, we have sometimes we joke around about these different misconceptions of Jesus in the North American church,
Yeah.
um uh, like John Wayne
Yeah,
Jesus, or
Jesus and John May. Yeah, yeah.
these
Yep.
different things, or like smoke machine Jesus, or I'll
Sure.
say crystal ball Jesus. But
Yep.
there's this, again, the psychological phenomena of magical thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and this
Yep.
magical thinking, the it's we've oversimplified the spiritual dilemma of being in relationship with a
Yeah.
loving God by trying to create clear rules of how
Yeah.
to create our own
Yeah.
assurance, which is a God complex.
Sure. Absolutely. Well, and I think part of that is like we create this false understanding of blissful ease and positive emotions all the time. Right? Like if I really believe that God loves me, that's going to be somehow equivalent to like a schoolyard crush. I'm just going to feel warm and fuzzy all the time. And like I imagine, Tara, in the psychology world, that you would be really upfront with people and say, you know what? You're not always going to feel good all the time, and that's okay. Like sometimes going through these negative emotions are like is actually good. It can be helpful. Um, and we don't always. I had somebody ask me once, Kyle, do you always feel God's love? And I said, no. Like God's love isn't just this emotion that cascades over me all the time. I think it's a fact, it's not a feeling. And I can, and we can talk about that. But when we make the life of faith just seeming to be about rainbows and unicorns and this blessed feeling all the time, we do ourselves we're lying to ourselves.
Yeah. And it's because it's relational, and
Yeah.
it's interesting because I don't think I ever have. So I'm a experiential attachment focused clinician, and I work with couples and families a lot, and then some individuals, but couples come in, and it's not as if they say like the goal is to never fight again, but there's this unspoken
Yeah.
sort of like longing. We're in therapy to
Sure.
cure our
Yeah.
conflict.
Mhm.
And eventually I get to a place with people where it's like, and usually early on, I'll say, like, the good news is it sounds like you two want to be together forever. The bad news is you're going to fight for the rest of your lives. So
Sure.
the goal
Yeah.
is to understand the relational
Yeah.
dynamics so that we can see when the pattern is bad, so that we can
Absolutely.
catch the pattern, so that we can
Yeah.
de-escalate the pattern, so that we can move back into
Yeah.
to being reconciled, or in the more beautiful place, which is not always rainbows and unicorns. But
Yeah.
again, we are in relationship with ourselves, with others, and with the supernatural love of
Hmm.
God.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And either love science is true, and so God exists, or love science isn't true. That's my bias.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Well, well, and as a priest, I'm committed to the fact that, love is true and God is true, and all that kind of stuff.
That's good. That's really
Yeah,
good.
yeah, right. But yeah, like what we have to understand what it is. I like that analogy of two couples who are, in love that they never want to separate, but that means they're going to fight for the rest of their lives. And and I think that's a very healthy way to understand relationship, right? And
Yeah.
um, and that's what happens with our life with God as well. If you read the Psalms are filled with people yelling at God and just saying, "Where are you? Like, where are you? Why is this happening? Why is this going on? Please do something." And
Yeah.
that's a function of, I think, a really good relationship that you can actually bring all the raw stuff and the ugly stuff of ourselves um, to God with this daring belief that even in that ugliness, I will still be loved, I will still be accepted, and God will still be with me.
Yeah, that's lovely, Kyle. And it's like, so there's this, my human experience is this spiritual discouragement, but the wiser other, the bigger, stronger, wiser, and kind nature of God is such that he's like, I am not discouraged. I'm not
Sure. Yeah.
discouraged when I see your flaws. Like as a parent, or
Yeah.
when we lean into more consolidation in our marriage, where it's like, yeah, you know what? I
Yeah.
married a human being and he drives me crazy. I almost never
Sure.
drive him crazy though. It's surprising. I'm like so easy to live with. It's honestly. But we drive each other
Sure.
crazy. And yet the more consolidation is, it's like, this isn't a deal breaker.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
can find my footing so that we can find our way back. Or when I can't find my footing, you can.
Yeah.
And that lends into this better truth of there is a consolidation we can have in our relationship with God, where we don't have to be perfect before we
Absolutely.
are.
Yeah.
And we don't get to be perfect this side.
No. No, exactly. And that allows you to be who you fully are, right? Um, always, always recognizing that also doesn't mean that you can just do whatever you want. Like sometimes we make the perfect love of God. Well, God will love you, God will forgive you, God will care for you, God will accept you. Okay, that means I can just I don't have to worry about that. But that's kind of like saying, well, I'm in the marriage for life, and so it doesn't matter what I do. Well, no, it still matters, right? Because you want to live fully into who you are in that relationship. And so the fact that God is unyieldingly loving towards us and faithful and accepting and saying, I will always be here. Um, I will be with you until the ends of the world, means that we always have an opportunity to experience that if we choose to embrace it.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you say that, I'm drawn right back to the Garden of Gethsemane. And I'd never thought about this before, but
Mm,
it's like, that I don't want to be asleep when my husband is
sure.
going through a great torment
Yeah,
and pain. If he will tell me, I want
sure.
to be awake to be with him as he's going through that. It takes vulnerability to ask the person to be there.
Absolutely.
Just as it does with God, it takes courage and it takes a different way of being to say, like, well,
Yeah.
could you meet me in my unmeetable place?
Yeah.
And the 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 like amazing thing is, and I think it's overwhelming and it could be frightening, even though it doesn't have to be, is that when we are in that anguish spot praying, take this cup from me,
Mhm.
God is never asleep.
No, exactly. Yeah. No.
And that's strange. It's not something to easily move past. That's something to contemplate on.
No, exactly. It is. And and I think the reason why the Garden of Gethsemane is such a powerful image is because there is in some sense there Jesus tarried there for a while. Like he went to
Mm,
pray and then he went to see his friends. They were sleeping, so he went to pray again. And then went back and his friends were asleep, so he went to pray again. Like it wasn't just this, arrow prayer that Jesus shot up and said, "All right, let's go on." Right? Like so he was there for a bit, right? And so this recognition that God never sleeps. He who watches over you will never slumber nor sleep, and God dwells with us in the midst of our darkness. It's not this spiritual soundbite that we get, like it's not a band-aid that we get to place on ourselves and it just makes the wounds go away and happy day. Like that's not what it does. It calls us to recognize that it's okay if we tarry in that place too. That the presence of God actually allows us to go into that to darkness and walk through whatever it might be for us and not have to pretend that it doesn't exist.
yeah. And it's not a Santa Claus
Yeah.
omni knowing or omnipresent sort of thing. It's this maternal nature of God.
Yeah.
Like that when we have children, and I think paternal too, but there is this very nurturing wombiness of God's
Yeah.
awakeness,
Yeah.
that when you're baby and we are children, and there's a sense of I am awake to you, even if I'm, you know, taking care of
Yeah.
whatever else,
Yeah.
like even if I,
Exactly.
like for the mom, she's sleeping, but she's alert to baby.
Sure. Of course.
So
Yeah.
it's a different thing. So just because it's again, when we see what's hardwired into us,
Hmm.
and it's like, well, where does that come from? We could have just been all nature. We could have just been cells or amoebas or whatever. Like,
Sure.
why
Yeah.
do we have consciousness? Why do we need nurture to survive?
Hmm.
So I wanted
Hmm.
to put this out there for you too, because
Sure.
fitting in with our human relationship to God, and God, our Trinitarian view, that there's something very healing in trusting that
Yeah.
the God who cares for the universe has a deep understanding and knowledge of
Of it. Yeah.
humanity
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
experience of
Yep.
humanness.
Yep.
And there's like what I think this was one of the big points of like challenging my view years ago, before I should have. I was exposed to Neil Anderson's stuff and trained in like spiritual warfare
Okay.
ministry.
Sure.
It's too,
Okay.
it was, that's not, don't teach your
Sure. Okay.
13-year-old
No.
how
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
do deliverance
No.
ministry.
Sure. Okay.
But years
Sure.
later
Yeah.
when I'm
Yeah.
revisiting his
Yeah.
stuff, because he's great. I still appreciate a lot of what he does, and his thoroughness and the privateness of doing something like
Sure.
that. Like
Yeah.
that's a very sacred thing. It's not a public,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's not the stage ministry.
No, of course not. No, no, no. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but Anglicans will agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but he talks about 5 levels of forgiveness, and he's like,
Hmm.
I might get the first few wrong, but it's like seeking others forgiveness,
Okay.
forgiving others, forgiving yourself, asking God's forgiveness,
Hmm.
forgiving God.
Okay. Yeah.
And
Wow. Yeah.
I like lingering in that forgiving God, because I've had so many experiences in this office with people where it's like, what about forgiving God?
Hmm. Yeah.
God hurts our feelings.
Hmm.
Leaning into the question of like, do I forgive God? We worry that then we're doing something sacrilegious or
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
unforgivable.
Yeah. 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 There's yeah, like so, in 2015, my wife had a cancer journey, and I was really kind of unprepared for the spiritual overhaul that would happen in my life because of it as the caregiver. And you know, people would say to me all sorts of bad things, right? God's not picking on her, he's handpicking her to bestow his glory. Like, ugh, right? Like all of this kind of these theological, well,
I never heard that one.
heresies.
That's
Oh, yeah,
a
oh, absolutely. Tara, you just need to pray your pain away, right? Like, right? Like all this kind of stuff. And I remember, and people would say, oh, there's a reason for this. There's a reason for this. And I remember thinking, you know, if I knew a reason, and if my wife knew a reason why she got cancer, would that make it better? No. Like it would do nothing. And so I think maybe part of this kind of forgiving God is, forgiving God for not giving us the answers or not provide, the answers that wouldn't help anyway.
yeah.
But, recognizing that we don't get to see all the stuff, and so we're always seeing through a glass dimly.
Mm,
Um, and in some sense, the forgiving God is allowing us to be flawed and dim and allowing God to be God and
mm.
recognizing that that's okay and that sometimes there's going to be some frustrations and some hurt feelings because of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that too. And the, really the psychology of it, like our human experience when we go through the most unthinkable pain,
Yeah.
is to ride the waves of emotion until it crashes on the beach and the next emotion comes. And the good psychology is like, I feel my pain so that it
Hmm.
can move through me and whatever other emotions, otherwise it's stuck.
Sure.
And so often in Christian culture, somebody's going through a hard time and we shine it up and we say,
Yep.
God works all things for good, or
I know.
you
Yeah.
know
Yep.
um and um it's denying the human experience of how we are embodied as humans. We're
Absolutely.
created to have a body.
Yeah.
I didn't design this. So
Yep.
if I believe somebody designed this entity, that whomever gave us this existence said,
Yep.
when bad things happen, you're going to have emotion and you don't
Yep.
have to like fix it. You just get to feel it.
Yeah. 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 Yep.
So the reason, and that's giving somebody an answer so they can pop away. This is some of the institutional trauma.
Hmm. Hmm.
What I like about what you're saying is you're sort of reframing Jesus's prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. We didn't plan this, by the way. This
No,
is just like
no,
we just
exactly.
we're in the garden. We're
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
garden
Yep.
with Jesus, and
Yeah.
I'm okay with this. I hear you reframing. You're like, you know what, Tara? I just heard Jesus praying, and you know what he said? Why
Hmm.
me?
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. Definitely.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Like there's a whole, yeah. Yeah. There's a whole lot of probably unspoken questions that's there, right? The fact, the humanity of Jesus and is the heartbeat of, well, of Christian faith, this
Hmm.
whole idea of the incarnation. And so you can't, like, if you divorce the humanity and the gut wrenchedness of Gethsemane from Jesus. Why me? Why are you doing this? Take this away from me. How come my friends don't care? All of this kind of, there's got to be a different way. All of that, if you just remove all of that under this thin veneer of God's purposes, then you just completely deny the incarnation. And then everything starts to kind of crumble from there.
Yeah, I love that. And that fits. So there's that challenge for like, first off, if I am believing in God, in the
Hmm.
Trinitarian God. Second off, for the people like myself who broke out
Yep.
and was dismayed when I talked about Jesus' sadness, and other people were like, but he's God.
I,
He's
sure.
God. He
Yeah, he's
wasn't
got
sad. He
absolutely, I
knew.
know. Yeah.
He knew what
Yeah.
was happening. How would they know? Because they were being chased and everybody hated them. Like they knew
Exactly.
something bad was
Yeah.
happening.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And how do you fall asleep and not keep
Yeah.
watch?
Yeah. Yeah, it's so unfortunate that, and this is really what I think that probably, because mega churches are so huge now and what's known as the prosperity gospel is so like attractive and so big, that reclaiming this um messy Jesus, right? Sad Jesus. Um, I think it's just
Mm,
really important because that's, Hebrews talks about we do not have, he uses the language of high priest. We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses
hmm.
because he's been there. He's been tempted. And, in order to be tempted, there must have been a little, a little chance. You might say maybe 1%, maybe who knows, but a little bit of a chance that Jesus would have taken the devil up on his offer, right? Make this stone some bread. Oh, I could do that. Like there must have been something that Jesus felt tempted. He felt sad. He felt betrayed. The thorns hurt him, right? And all of that. And so we have to uncover that because it's in that place that we actually uncover the love of God, not in the removal of all the hurtful things in our lives, but in the willingness to be there with us in the midst of
Yeah.
it.
I love it. I like this new language. You gave me new language, messy
Okay.
Jesus.
Yeah,
Because
that's yeah.
when in attachment language, we're like, will you meet me in my unmeetable place? But then also
Hmm.
this like, the message is in the mess.
Yeah, okay. Yep.
And so
Yeah.
there is this mess and there's, yeah, so much of our deconstruction, our reconstruction of the better process through psychological recovery
Hmm.
is it's messy and it's painful and it feels spiritual and there's a wisdom, it's not just knowledge then.
Sure. Yeah.
And if we are trying to, like, again, if we touch the institutional trauma, the spiritual abuse, and we think that being upset about it is deconstructing,
Yeah.
that misconception does not lend us to finding the mess and processing into wisdom.
Exactly. That's true. Absolutely.
It
Yeah.
can give us knowledge. Like it's not fair for some old man to tell you not to wear a bikini because then or when I got a tattoo and I was told I was marked by Satan. Like that
Okay.
wasn't
Sure.
cool. That's
That
not
wasn't cool.
cool.
No,
It's like I have
exactly.
a Jesus tattoo and I'm going to hell now. Like
Yeah,
I
I
don't,
know. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, like those things where that gave me knowledge,
Hmm.
but not wisdom.
No. No, absolutely. I cringe whenever I hear stories about that, right? Like it's just, yeah, there's so much damage. There's so much damage that is done. And it makes us seem like, well, we just have to be perfect, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's so insidious and people don't even know that they're doing it sometimes. I was working with an editor And I was putting out a book, Alive, Loved, and Free, Finding Jesus When Faith is Hard. And that was the tagline. And the first edit that my editor offered was, well, the subtitle should be changed, Finding Jesus When Faith Seems Hard. As if true faith isn't actually hard. You don't actually struggle with anything if you're truly faithful. If it seems to be faithful, well, it's probably because you're not doing it right. Um, and so I wrote them back and just said, no, like I'm going to keep that because, you know, I like that language of, the message is in the mess. It's in the mess that we find the Jesus who meets us.
It is. And I mean, and seeming it. So it's so funny because in my book, and we're going to talk about your book in a second,
Sure.
just to sort
Yeah,
of
no worries.
let
No, that's
people
fine. Yeah.
let people know about it. But I had a trainer in when I first got into the emotionally focused work, and she would talk about we want to make things explicit with people. We don't want to poo-poo it. We don't want to
Yeah.
sidestep it. We don't want to minimize. Don't shame it. Don't blame it. Don't lame it. So in
Okay.
my book, I had said something, don't shame it, don't blame it, don't lame it. My editor's like, lame is like, what do you mean by that word? Because it's
Yeah.
like, it's slang, it's
Sure.
90s slang, but there's
Yep.
this laming, like, it's like, that's so lame
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
just the minimizing that
Hmm.
faith. If we have faith, our pain is only seemingly there.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. Yeah.
And it lames it. It lames it
Yeah.
as if our pain is a stallion, if it's a wild horse,
Sure.
our
Yeah.
pain is a
Okay.
wild horse and it's beautiful, and find a wild horse nowadays, that's magic.
Hmm.
And we lame it because
Yeah. Yeah.
because I don't, because again, we don't, I guess it's that secret guilt, shame, or spiritual discouragement thing.
Yeah. And sometimes, all these things that we do to lame something or, the theological band-aids that we place on something, just pray your pain away and all this kind of stuff. It's not like if I say that to you, it's not actually to help you, Tara. It's to let me off the hook because I don't know what to say. Right? I don't want to deal with your messiness and your ugliness and the questions that it arises in me. So I'm going to place on you some sort of band-aid, some spiritual
Yeah.
soundbite that sounds nice and sounds faithful, but doesn't actually do anything.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but for healing to occur, we actually need to allow the wound to be the wound, right? And to enter into it.
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah,
we don't have to fix it. And I mean,
we don't
here's
have to
this.
fix it. Yeah.
Let's talk about your book, but you're talking about in such a pastoral care way,
Yeah.
and I'm a psychologist, and we're concurring. It's like, so I'm not trying to fix things for people. I'm pointing out what's hidden in plain sight,
Hmm.
and I
Yep.
am entering into co-regulation to have an experience where we can feel it together in as safe a way as possible. And you're talking from a pastoral point of view of like, you're not trying to fix it either. You're not Bible versing
No,
people
no,
into.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He just do the Romans road and you'll be fine. Right? Like it's just, yeah, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about your book, because this is a it's a big deal to write.
It is. Yes. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. It was a labor of love and frustration and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's called Alive, Loved, and Free, Finding Jesus When Faith is Hard. And what it is, it's kind of reflections on what happened within me in my spiritual life um, with my wife's cancer. She had a very kind of serious cancer diagnosis. She's fine now. But even as an ordained priest, and I was ordained at 14 years at that point, I was just unprepared
Yeah.
for the amount of struggle and dis-ease and discouragement that I would face as just as the caregiver, right? And so the book is my story, it's not hers. But I just, I remember I have a chapter in there on prayer because I remember like my prayers dried up. Like, and I had been praying certain prayers. I've been doing a liturgy for years, and all of the prayers that I've memorized, I just couldn't say. I would sit in my chair and just sit there, right? And not be able to say any prayers. My spiritual life just felt so deeply hollow. And in the midst of kind of going through this time, ended up discovering, finding Jesus when faith is hard, discovering a presence of God in the midst of that place far more deeply than I had ever really ever thought. And so the book kind of chronicles, there's kind of
Mhm.
three things happening. There's my story. There is the story of um, Jesus to the cross, right? And then there's kind of the story of kind of how we do that in our church. So a liturgy kind of thing. So it kind of interweaves all those things. But in looking at Jesus' journey to the cross, his betrayal, his arrest, his crucifixion, um, I stop at the crucifixion. I don't really go into Easter. It shows up in the
Mhm.
conclusion, but that's because I wanted to stay right there. And this
In the
kind of
pain and in the
and the
unknowing.
pain,
Yeah.
absolutely. And in this Holy Saturday,
Mm.
which is kind of like this day of nothingness, like where Jesus apparently just lies in the grave, and we don't know what's happening next. Um, and so that book kind of really articulates how I found a deeper presence of God in my life by recognizing that God journeys with me in this very normal understanding of discouragement in our faith.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah. That's, I love that too. And, like, I think it's interesting when you say when Jesus is laying in the tomb on the third day. And again, because I'm like, I'm fine with people who think of Jesus as a metaphor. I still think
sure.
this conversation is meaningful and it's
Yeah,
uplifting, I think, too, for people who are stuck on Holy Saturday. Buy
yeah.
Kyle's book because
Oh,
lots
thank
of
you. Yeah,
us, Holy
yeah,
Saturday can be a really long time. My Holy Saturday was a really long time, and there could be
sure.
another one coming, and there probably is, you
Absolutely.
know.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I like, I sort of, this is being playful, but it's almost like this cosplay, like version
Hmm.
of realizing, like in the moment, in the live action of the story, there's this day where he is just lying there, the
Absolutely. Yep.
meaning making, the continuation of the story, the backfilling of what was the spiritual significance of Holy Saturday.
Yeah.
But you think of like Mary Magdalene, who's one of my personal favorites,
Yeah.
and you think of Mommy Mary, you think of
Yeah.
the disciples, the people in hiding.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah,
you know
definitely.
I was sleeping while my friend was praying.
Hmm.
He died the worst death, and I hid
Yeah.
and ran and denied him. Now
Yeah.
he's dead, and I'm hiding in an apartment somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and and so I just love the fact that the word excruciating literally means out from the cross, right? Because it was so like painful, right? Like everything just crashes down. In preparation for the book, I read some books on Holy Saturday, and there's an interesting conversation theologically that happens. Some people, like, what do you do with Holy Saturday? After Jesus has been crucified, before he's been resurrected, what happens? Some people like to think that, well, Jesus goes and like body slams Satan. Like he descends to the dead and he is like he's just cleaning house, right? And he's there, he's doing battle. Others say, no, like Jesus is lying dead. Like he's not doing anything because the resurrection hasn't happened. He's been crucified, he's been
Mm,
executed, and he's just lying there, which is kind of where I am with that because I think that is the full association with us. Like again, if we make Jesus Rambo Jesus, John Wayne Jesus all the time, then Jesus never identifies with the deaths that I die and the waitings that I have to wait
mm,
and the questions that I have to ask but don't have answers for. Like if we completely change Jesus into that kind of movie star Jesus, then there's no association. But for Jesus to be crucified and lie there on Saturday is this full embracing of the fullness of our humanity.
Yeah, it's an interesting point of contemplation, and all of the conquering of death and what that means. And
Hmm.
even no matter what we believe, still that the human body of
Yeah.
Jesus was laying there in
Yeah,
that day.
absolutely. Yeah.
Um, and too, it's interesting when you're talking about Jesus like body slamming Satan. And I remember when I was a kid in summer camp and they played this song, and it was like Jesus and Satan were in this boxing ring, and it was a
Really?
long song. It was like 5 minutes. And I remember uh finding it deeply frightening. I was a school
Sure.
child. Again, don't play that song for a
No.
9-year-old at
No,
summer
absolutely.
camp when they're
Yep.
sleeping away from their parents for a week.
Sure.
Like, again,
Yeah.
Christians, pay
Come
attention.
on.
This
Pay
is
attention. Yeah,
bad
yeah.
leadership.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I was deeply frightened. And I think it also just didn't sit with me, because I'm like, yeah, we can believe God's violent. We can believe God killed Jesus, but what
Sure.
does that say about love? And
Yeah.
so, I mean, there's these things that I didn't know I knew it when I didn't know it. Like, I was like, that wouldn't be what he would do if
Sure. Yeah.
however, he's conquering death. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
think he's wearing white satin shorts.
Sure. Exactly.
He's
No, absolutely.
the
Yeah.
gloves aren't red.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Like exactly, right? And so um again, yeah, it's the unwillingness to kind of sit within that kind of stuff. And we have to be willing to sit there. And we have to be willing to actually go into that place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I like too when you're bringing up, it's so interesting how these conversations evolve, because it's a very nice like expose on all these like strange things that we
Yeah,
talk about,
yeah.
like movie star Jesus or the
Exactly.
filmography. And a
Yeah.
lot of spiritual abuse is creating this filmography. So the boxing match
Yeah.
between Jesus and Satan.
Yeah.
Children don't need a movie for themselves to just lean into the mystery,
No, exactly. Absolutely. Yeah.
because the mystery of all of this is just so mysterious. You saying, yeah, I'm of the school of thought that Jesus is just laying there, and that is conquering death. And I'm like, that is so mysterious.
It is. Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. Yep. Yeah.
It's
We have to embrace that, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
embrace the mystery. And like, I'm a big fan of, I mean, we have excellent fiction about after death, but we have
No.
some knowledge, but
No.
we just make a lot of it up. But I
Sure.
really like Dante's Divine Commedia. I don't know if I agree with it
Okay.
all,
Sure. Yeah,
but
yeah.
I
Yeah.
find it very curious to think with Dante
Hmm.
about the mystery as Dante is
Sure.
trying to uncover and discover and rediscover.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I think, like for me, one of the and like I said, I don't really kind of go into the resurrection in the book, but one of the things that I try to do bring out is this understanding that so Jesus is raised, of course, in the Bible, but he still's got the wounds. He still has the wounds in his hands, right? And so, like in some sense, even this resurrected life of okay, this is the life of victory and power and whatever, all the language you want to put, there's still the wounding.
Yeah.
Like it goes on, right? It's still there. And so we can't pretend that it just vanishes and Jesus is now living the high life and everything's fine. Like no, he still had the wounds stick with us and they remain and the scars remain. Um, but in those we can see testimonies of God's love for our woundedness and
Mm,
for our mess.
yeah. And our own human body, it gives us permission. Jesus had been scarred by the painful things he endured, and he had
Yep,
physical scars to prove it.
yep, yep,
And so my scars my psychological
Yep.
scars, my
Sure.
emotional scars, my deficits and ability to connect with
Yep.
myself or others or God are included.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
the
Yeah.
scars, the belonging. We have such a profound identity of belonging.
Mhm.
So book number two, just throwing it out, Kyle, I think that it's probably resurrection and ascension.
Uh, no, no, it won't be.
No?
Like,
Oh,
no,
okay.
like, what I want to write on now is, and it's going to be, and I'm not sure if it's going to be kind of for an everybody thing or if it's going to be for Christian leaders kind of thing. But I kind of want to lean into the story of Moses as, here is somebody who decides to follow God and then just never knows what's going on. and and he gets angry and he yells, and he gets it right and he has some, but he also gets it really, really wrong, and he never sees the end of the journey, right? Like, and so, like, I think there's something there about what our spiritual life is like when we don't know what we're doing and we
Yeah.
don't know where we're going. And in some sense, that's the story of faith, right? And
It,
so,
the story of faith and story of humanity, because
yeah,
we're kind of making it up as we go
yeah,
along, and where Moses made a ton of mistakes
he
that
did.
he couldn't avoid until he had done it, and then hopefully, we screw it up, and then we look at it and we say, okay, I get that
Yeah,
now.
sure.
But
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
yeah, and I mean that's so much of, again, the philosophical meaning of deconstruction is I look at it and I make meaning from it so
sure.
that there's a transformative moment and wisdom.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Hmm. So then that's book number two, and then I figured out book number three. So
You
you're
put it,
welcome. You're
yes,
welcome.
you're welcome. Yeah,
Yeah, cool. Okay, so I have a question for you, but I
sure.
don't know, maybe you have some different things too. Um, so okay, now I got distracted because I was
Okay.
just like, in your cathedral, are there stained glass windows? That's just my side like
No, there
squirrel.
is. There is stained glass
Uh,
windows. Yeah, there are. Yeah. We have one which is just kind of actually quite beautiful. It faces it faces the rising sun, and it's kind of a three pictures: faith, hope, and charity. Is the faith, hope, and love. And on
mm,
Sunday mornings, I get to the church at 6 a.m. And there's certain times of the year when around 7 o'clock nobody else is in the church, and the sunrise just beams through that window, and it's beautiful. Love it.
I'm so glad I asked you that question.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
yeah,
And Kamloops is pretty special. It's like in the interior of
yeah.
BC. It's like um fruit country, it's wine country, it's a
Mhm.
kind of the desert, which people are surprised
It
by.
is. It's a very unique climate, because it has its own little ecosystem and desert kind of feel to it, and but it's kind of this intersection of highways and rivers and lakes all around us, and it's really quite beautiful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So because I want to ask you just your sort of take on um Bishop Marianne Buddy, because
Ah,
she's, okay, I love her.
sure. Yep. Yeah.
So when you, as an Anglican, and I'm just wondering, you see her, and how was that for you watching her? Or
Like I've met her. I met her at a conference, and super personable, super lovely. Um, and Yeah, and so I give her utmost props and credit to finding a way, and she just did it perfectly. Like, she didn't
I know,
lambast, she didn't argue, she didn't yell. She was very reserved, very respectful, just calling for compassion and grace, and just articulating, and which is what I think priests and bishops are called to do, articulating the prayers of the people, and particularly at the
yeah,
national prayer breakfast, that's what they're supposed to be doing. And so she was just Um, yeah, she did everything that she did, and of course, um, the the vitriol afterwards from and some of the rhetoric. And one of the things that I picked up on was this constant phrase in the aftermath of this so-called bishop, as if her, you know, her title and her ordination and her training and all that kind of stuff, well, that didn't actually count anymore. And somehow she had a facade to her. But I think that kind of sense of, and as she called him to compassion, called Trump to compassion, she exuded compassion, right? Like that in her presentation. And so
Sincere compassion,
sincere
sincere
compassion,
compassion.
sincere compassion. Yeah.
Yeah, which
Yeah.
you can't. I like people have. I've had people say to me, "Oh, that's acting," or "That's just this thing." You can, as as a pastor, as somebody who speaks, as somebody,
Yeah.
I can have all of the compassionate nuances of what I would like to say, but to be in my window of tolerance and to give the message and stay within love's kind is
Yeah.
something completely different. Like
Absolutely.
you can't fake being within love's kind at the level like she did it.
No,
She was
exactly.
loving and
Yeah.
within a prayer for mercy.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
it's, that the seeming bishop, it reminds me of your book title. And it's like, when it
Yeah.
seems like
Yeah, exactly. Then it's got to be something wrong. Yeah, no, I know. Yeah.
it's this undermining
It
of,
is an undermining. Yeah.
and it's a good parallel. And it's nothing like your editor wasn't trying to do that. It's just what's in
No.
us.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
totally how we talk. It's like,
Yeah.
well, it seems like I'm going through a hard time. No,
Yeah.
I'm going through a hard time.
No, yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly.
She's not
Absolutely.
she's not allegedly a bishop. She's a bishop.
No, she's a bishop. And
She's a bishop.
sure, exactly. And like in some sense, you could have, she's a bishop. You could have just said, well, we disagree with her. Okay, right? But this undermining is, well, we can get into the whole world of politics and all that kind of stuff, right? But it all feeds into that same, you know, faith makes you powerful and victorious. And if you're not powerful and victorious, then something's wrong.
Yeah.
And right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah. And even the act of having written a book, something you and I share in common, and
Yeah.
having written, and what you think it's going to mean back in the day when you're dreaming about, what if I just did this thing? Like, what if I wrote a book?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not a powerful experience to lean into our participating. When we're participating at the fullness of who we are,
Absolutely. Yeah.
I don't need to be powerful to just be offering and to be yielding and to be producing
Yeah.
alongside of others, and to realize I'm included and to
Sure. Absolutely.
receive being included more than to receive rejection.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and yeah, there's lots of vulnerability that goes in. Like,
Mm,
and when you put any book forward, but I think particularly if you're putting a book in terms of care and caring for others in any sort of way, like your book, like my book,
mm,
there is a certain amount of you know confessional quality, soul bearing that happens, which then is terrifying when you put it out into the world.
yeah. It's first terrifying, and then I had this conversation with William Paul Young a couple weeks ago, but it's like it's I feel afraid or terrifying. And Paul corrected me. He's like, I think though it's like, or not necessarily thinking. It's like it's not fear. It's when we're participating in the things that are of love's kind, it's overwhelming.
Oh, sure. Okay.
And so, like I think that there's this thing of like the or what we might call holy fear, or this
Hmm.
like, oh wow, like that is such a big, bold, beautiful thing.
Yeah.
It's like a positive intoxication.
Sure. Yeah.
And it's alarming, and it's overwhelming,
Yeah.
uh, which is also a huge point of contemplation.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah, yeah.
So I'm just thinking like for you, Kyle, in all of this, what we're talking about, or maybe some of the other points of how you lean in with people, or you want to impart your wisdom
Hmm.
about the spiritual healing.
Yeah.
Um, where do you land in all that? Do you have anything as we wind things down? What would you like to say?
Um, there's so many things that I could say. Like it's, you know, well, I think one of the things and that I found myself repeating a couple times recently is, and we can use it over the. I'll talk about it in terms of prayer because we've talked a lot about Gethsemane, but you can use it for anything. Um, I like to say, pray as you can, not as you can't, right? Like so often when we're in the that Gethsemane, and this is what I experienced. I couldn't say what the prayers that I always said, right? And um, I can't read my Bible for 20 minutes like I always did, or it dried up and I can't do this. And you heap upon yourself a whole lot of condemnation and that voice of judgment and rejection and all that kind of stuff saying is somehow, oh, well, I guess you're not as faithful as you said, right?
Mhm.
And all this kind of stuff, which just exacerbates everything. And no, like if all you can do is just fall down and cry like Jesus did, then that's enough.
Yeah,
I
that's
just
a liturgy.
That's the liturgy, right? I talked to a spiritual director during this time and I said, I just can't pray. And he said, a child who is crying um, doesn't have to say anything. It's enough just to cry in the presence of their parent. And so, like, if all you can do is just sit in your chair and go, oh, for whatever spiritual thing, that's enough, right? And so, do
Yeah.
the spiritual life that you can, not the one you can't.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And it's good to have, like I did this vlog years ago before I really talked about deconstruction or knew that that was a thing we were talking about, but I called it constructed prayers and deconstructed prayers,
Okay,
thinking of, the Food Network.
sure.
Because
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
there's the Lord's Prayer, and that this is Brian Zann's kind of thing,
Yeah,
is like the Lord's Prayer, and then you like ad lib,
yeah,
or
yeah, yeah, yeah.
you really, that's a better view of deconstructing, is I know what it is, and I am just playing
You're
with the
riffing off it. Yeah,
language, and
exactly. Yeah.
I'm riffing, I'm putting my body into it. But this pray as you can, not as you can't. And I'm glad that you doubled back there because we hit it. But I do love driving this home, and it's ebbs and flows. And like,
Yeah.
even when my book was coming out last year and people would think, oh, hi life, you're doing amazing. Like waves of anxiety. And again, Paul Young, it's like, how many times have people referenced talking to Paul? But I reached out to Paul. Why? I don't know. Because why,
Mhm.
it's Paul Young. But I'm like,
Sure.
Paul, I'm just losing it. And I
Yeah.
don't know how to pray. And he said, well, Lord have mercy.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
I went through a big season. This was last year where I I was praying as I could.
Hmm.
And
Yep.
there was this pocket, this big pocket, months where my prayer was just, Lord have mercy.
Yep.
And moving through that refining and that trusting experience that this is where I'm led to pray,
Yep. Yep. Absolutely.
and I'm okay. The secret shame and guilt
Yep.
is
Yep.
okay here, and that spiritual discouragement can be encouraged, that this is the only prayer I have right now.
Yeah, exactly. When my wife was going through chemotherapy, brain fog is a huge thing, right? So she literally couldn't think her way into any sort of prayers, right? So all that she could do is rub her hands over some prayer beads. And
Yeah.
for her, that was enough. Like just rub some, like so yeah, so do what you can, right? Dare to believe that it's enough and
Yeah.
that it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And the wisdom. you know, the wisdom of the prayer. I love that visual of just the wisdom of trusting. I can rub my hands over prayer beads.
Yep.
And that's beautiful. So Kyle, I love everything about this conversation. I'm going to put all of Kyle's info down below, not
Perfect.
all of it. Like I'm sure his home address, I'm not putting that.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. That maybe not.
But book info, where
Sure.
you can find his book, his website. If you're in Kamloops and you want to check out St. Paul's Cathedral and the beautiful stained glass window at 7 a.m.
7 a.m. I'm there.
So thank you so much, Kyle. And I mean, like Western Canadians, if you're looking for people to link up with, find me, find Kyle.
Absolutely.
We can try to link each other up. We're kind of a disjointed group of people trying to heal and fall back in love with love. So thank you.
Tara, thank you. This has been an absolutely amazing conversation. I've really loved this. This is fabulous.
I know. It's so exciting. It's just like Canadians, when we get excited, we're like, yay!
Yeah, exactly.